Welcome to Spiritual Journeys, program number 3. In programs 1 and 2, we shared with you my personal testimony, how I became a Christian, and we also shared with you about how the Lord convicted my wife, Christy, and I to move our ever-growing family into the country. On this program, we're going to head a new direction. We're going to share with you about how our ministry was started. And you're going to find that some of the material on here is going to be a little sensitive, and I'm sure many of you will be able to relate to it. But the questions we need to ask ourselves in the beginning of this program is, what does whiskey, getting a new pastor, church politics, and attitudes have to do with it? Well, I guess you're going to have to watch to find out. When we finally made a commitment to follow Christ completely in our lives, my wife and I unitedly decided that we wanted to move into the country. When we were living in Montana, we found out that a lot of the people that we were associating with in our church were not excited about the things that we were studying. I mean, we were just new Christians and we were on fire, and we were studying about dress and diet and different things like that, and we were studying theological issues like on the sanctuary, and we found that a lot of people weren't really all that interested in those things that we were studying, and we kind of started to think maybe we were the only ones still that believed those kind of things, you know, and we moved to Idaho, and we came into contact with a group of people in the church that believed exactly the same way we did. There was a group of young people there, and they dressed the same way we did, and they ate the same way we did, and they believed theologically a lot of the same things we did. They were quite independent, to be honest with you, like we were, and they were also critical of the church like we were. But, you know, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about that, but why don't we go in the studio where it's a little bit warmer, because I'm freezing out here. It's cold out there. Like I was saying, when we moved here 25 years ago, we were happy to find a group of people at this local church that thought a lot the same way that we thought. In fact, they were a pretty independent group and dressed the same way we did and ate the same way we did, and they were pretty critical of the church like we were. And it was actually kind of a nice adjustment after leaving the state of Montana and feeling like we were the only people in the whole world that were doing a lot of these different things as far as, you know, eating a certain way and dressing a certain way and studying really seriously about the sanctuary message and all these different things that were really pertinent to us. And basically, a group of us there controlled this little church here in St. Mary's, and like I said, this was like 25 years ago. And we had a pastor who was involved with evangelism when we first came here, and he had, by God's grace, won probably 5, 6 new baptisms here in this little community into the church. And then right after that, he took a call to go to another district. And so we lost our pastor. Now, don't think I'm being a heretic when I say this, okay? Because it was one of the greatest blessings in the world to lose our pastor. Okay, don't react too much. You got to hear me out on this. I'll tell you what happens. You know, in a church, when you have a pastor, you always depend on the pastor to do everything. In fact, you know, you have the pastor run the nominating committee. You have the pastor work on the Wednesday night prayer meeting, you know, leading out in that. He is the one that's responsible for looking for school for the church school, looking for property for the church school. He's the one that's basically having to do everything while the people basically sit in the pews. Well, when we lost our pastor, and being that we were already a fairly independent type of group of people, we all just pulled together and started running the church ourselves. And I started preaching on a regular basis, and we were giving Bible studies in the community, and we ran a cooking class in the community and a stop smoking class in the community. And our church actually kind of pulled together, and a lot of neat things were happening because we weren't being dependent upon a pastor. By the way, did you know that was the way the early Adventist churches were run? They had no place pastors in the churches, and the lay people ran the local churches while the pastor was out doing evangelism. Because I was really heavily involved with studying a lot and was getting up oftentimes at 4:30 in the morning, had a kerosene lamp because they didn't have electricity back in those days, I would study and share things at church. And they asked me, since we didn't have a pastor anymore, if I would like to take over the pastor's class for all the newly baptized church members. Well, first of all, I was a little bit nervous about calling it the pastor's class because I wasn't a pastor, I was just a layperson. So we ended up calling it a Bible doctrines class. And so I started making my own Bible study lessons for this class. We didn't use a regular Sabbath school quarterly in this class because, you see, what I wanted to do is I wanted to show the new church members that Seventh-day Adventists believe everything that they believe, sola scriptura, straight from the Bible. And so I would prepare lessons at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning with my kerosene lamp, with my Smith Corolla typewriter and go through different subjects. And the class actually was really a popular class in our church. In fact, we had quite a number of people that started coming to this class. And the thing about it, it was really refreshing for a lot of the people, because the first thing that we did, and remember this is like 1982, we had like a small group situation where we would ask each other how our week went, and we would pray, and we would spend time together praying specifically about challenges that we were having in our lives. And the neat thing about the class was that we all accepted each other for who we were. We'd disagree and we would debate, and it was all really done in a good spirit. And then when we would leave the class, you know, we all, even though sometimes we didn't see eye to eye on everything, we really still looked at each other and loved each other. You see, I had this ability, and so did a couple of the other church members, we had this ability to be very tolerant and loving towards people who were, quote, a little bit ignorant of the things that, quote, we understood. But when it came to people that knew better, then sometimes we weren't quite as tolerant or quite as nice. You know, about 6, 7, 8 months went by and something happened. Now, as I start to share this with you, I'm going to go into some sensitive things. And I know that some of you are not going to be able to see this whole presentation, because right in the middle of this presentation, if it's being broadcast on television, it's going to be cut off and you're not going to be able to see the whole presentation. But what I'm going to be talking about is kind of a sensitive situation. And if anybody thinks, as I'm sharing, you know, like, whoa, I can't believe that happened in their church. Well, the truth is, I have friends in the Assembly Church and the Baptist Church and the Adventist Church that have had problems in their churches with the pastor versus lay people, or lay people fighting amongst themselves. And I'm sure if you're going to a church, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because wherever there's people, there's problems. And sometimes people don't always agree with each other about different things, and sometimes some pretty bad attitudes come out. I'll never forget, since I was the head deacon, one morning I went to church. It was cold outside, and I would always get to church about 45 minutes early to warm the church up for the church services that morning. And as I went into the church, I noticed that there was a young man sitting in the front of the church. You know, I'd heard that the church had elected a new pastor to come to our district. And I also heard that this new pastor was actually about 2 months within my age. And I was really excited about the day that the new pastor would finally come to our church, because I was thinking, you know, this new pastor is going to be my age. We're both going to be on fire for the Lord. We're going to go out and do Bible studies together. We're going to do visitations together. And I had all these concepts in my mind thinking, wow, this is going to be so wonderful. Well, I went into the church and I saw this young man sitting up into the front pew, the second from the back front pew on the left-hand side of the church. And I walked in after I turned the heat up and walked up. And I'll just be honest with you, I was always a little bit nervous back in those days when I was in my early 20s. When I got around people who were police officers or doctors or pastors, you know, because I was an uneducated guy, you know, I lived in the backwoods of Idaho, and I'd get around, quote, professional people, I'd get nervous. And so I walked up and I said, hi, my name is Jeff Rich. Are you the new pastor? And we shook hands with each other. He goes, yeah, I'm the new pastor. And he was sitting there, and I didn't really know what to say. And I said, well, we're really happy to have you here. And I was nervous, and I was kind of tripping over my words a little bit. And then I said to him, I said, are you nervous about pastoring your first 2-church district? You know, I heard he just graduated from seminary. And the answer I got really surprised me. He said something like, well, frankly, I'm not a bit nervous about pastoring this district. He said, I'm fully qualified to handle any of the problems in this church. I interned at a church 5 times bigger than this, and at seminary they taught me how to handle problems in churches, and I'm fully qualified to pastor this church. I don't know about you, but what ended up happening to me is I got a big knot in my stomach, and I was thinking, oh no, we're in for trouble. And you know what? That was the beginning of the conflict. In fact, he was doing a series of meetings in our church, and I remember after the meetings on this one particular topic that he had given, that I caught him out in the parking lot. Now, I know this never happens in your church, and nothing like this has probably ever happened with anybody that you know, maybe, I doubt it, but I caught the pastor outside and I asked him a question, and it was quite a personal question about his beliefs and such, and he got a little bit upset at me, and he kind of retorted back to me, and so I said something to him, and next thing you know, here's the pastor and the head deacon. We're arguing with each other outside in the parking lot of the church. I was glad nobody drove by and saw us out there. And then I realized, all of a sudden this pastor and I were not getting along with each other. My dreams that I had weren't really happening. And he had some kind of, I think it was an Easter service at our church. And I was like, my wife and I got so upset with this kind of service that he had that we got up and we just walked out of the church. And being good Christians that we were, we slammed the door to the church when we left. We got in the parking lot, which was a gravel parking lot, and we peeled out with our car in the parking lot, being good Christians, And later on, he met us in the parking lot for Vespers that evening, and we got into another argument with the pastor. What started happening around this time is new people started moving into the area. The pastor had been there now for about 9 months to a year, and we started having new people move into the church. And we noticed that some of these people became friends with the pastor, and this core group of us that were really conservative, that were controlling the church, all of a sudden we're noticing that there was this other group that was forming that were not quite as conservative as us, and they were really, really good friends with the pastor. Well, to say the least, the next thing that happened was church elections, what we call in our church nominating committee. Nominating committee was coming up, and before I explain to you what happened with nominating committee, with the church elections, I need to tell you just a really quick story. You see, I was teaching, remember, the Bible doctrines class, which was really the pastor's class, and that meant that when the pastor would come to our church, which was every other week because there was 2 churches in the district, so he'd only be at our church once a week, that he would sit in on the pastor's class. I preferred to call it the Bible doctrines class. And the next thing I know, in the middle of this class, I was going through the book of Hebrews, talking about the sanctuary and talking about some different things. And he started challenging me in front of all these different, fairly newly baptized church members about some of the things I was teaching on the sanctuary. And it turned into a very embarrassing situation for the pastor, and he wanted to debate, and I refused to debate with him. And I told him, I said, Pastor, I said, if you want to come to the privacy of my home and talk about these things, I'll be happy to do that. But here with this group of people, I think we should follow the injunction in the scriptures that we should not wrangle about words which could be ruinous to the hearers. And I just looked at the floor, and you could have heard a pin drop in there. The air became so thick, and the pastor got really nervous, and he started looking around saying, hey, everybody, I'm sorry. Hey, Jeff, I'm sorry, because he'd really lost his temper in this service. And so what ended up happening, these church nominating committee, church elections came, and my wife and I were removed out of every single position in the church. And what ended up happening out of that is the church was just about split, because there was a group of people who were saying, why were Jeff and Christy removed from all their positions in the church? It's not right. And there was this other group saying, well, Jeff and Christy are too extreme, they're too fanatical, they live up in the woods without electricity, and they have these theological views about certain things that we don't agree with. And there was this split taking place in the church, and this fighting, and I'll be very frank with you. When you go through a situation where you're putting 150% of your life into something, you're giving Bible studies in the community, you dedicated yourself to the church and to the message of the church, and then all of a sudden you're booted out of all your positions. There's a lot of hurt. There's a lot of feelings that come with that. There's a lot of anger. There's feelings of rejection, like, you're just not good enough. You've become resentful, like, you're putting all this effort into it and you're just not good enough, and you start feeling just like you're being rejected. And I remember sitting at home thinking, maybe I'm not going to go to church anymore. I think I'll start a home church. I've heard about things like this happening in churches, but I never thought it would happen here at our little local church. And like I say, this was like 25 years ago, but I went home and I sat down with my Smith Corolla typewriter, which I had been writing my Sabbath school lessons on. And I thought, if some people here are upset about what I've been teaching in the Sabbath school lessons at church, maybe what I should do is just continue writing the Sabbath school lessons and send it out to all the church members. So I sat down with my typewriter, and I was thinking to myself, what should I call this? I'm not going to be teaching a Sabbath school class anymore, so it's going to be a newsletter. And I'm not a pastor, I'm just a layman, so it's a layman ministry. It's going to be a Laymen Ministry newsletter, Laymen Ministry News. And that's how Laymen Ministries was born. Laymen Ministries News was his first little newsletter that was a long rectangular paper that was published. And I started sending them out to all the church members. Well, that first mailing was 35 pieces. The next mailing within about a month was 60 pieces. Then the next mailing after that was 125 pieces. And it kept growing and growing and growing. Right now, I want to take you on a little bit of a change of stories. I've kind of laid down what was happening in our local church, and the situation there, but we're going to shift directions here. You see, about the same time all this was happening in our local church, and while I was feeling all these feelings of bitterness and resentment towards the pastor and towards some of the friends of the pastor in the church and losing my positions, there were some people that moved up into the woods in this area. We call them mountain people. And there was this couple named Jim and Mary. You see, they weren't married, they partied quite a bit. In fact, Jim and Mary moved into this little cabin here. As you can tell, it's quite small. I think that a man and his girlfriend were going to spend the winter in this, and it was late fall, early winter, just really starting to set in when they moved here. They decided they'd go around and meet all the different people in the community around up in the mountains here, and one of the people they decided to go see is my wife and I, and so they came over the mountain here to our place. And I remember they came up and we were visiting with them, and they partied quite a bit, and I think they were kind of finding out who they kind of fit in with, and they found out really quickly that they didn't fit in with us. In fact, I remember Jim and I went for a walk through the forest, and as we were walking through the forest, I was trying to be a good Christian, and I started witnessing to him. And as I started sharing Christ with him and different things that happened in my life and my testimony, he stopped and he looked at me and he said, "Look," he said, "if Jesus Christ appears before us right now on this trail, I'll believe that he exists. Until then, look, I don't want to hear another word about this, okay?" And he turned around and he left, and of course after that we were never visited anymore. This is Jim and Mary's truck. They were coming home from the bar one evening, and as they were driving home, the truck started to overheat, so Jim pulled over to the side of the road. He found out that his radiator hose broke, and so he was a smart guy. He knew what to do. He let the truck cool down. He got out some electrical tape from underneath the front seat of his truck, and he wrapped it around the radiator hose and patched it. Took a beer can out of the back of the truck, and he went down to the creek and took the can and broke the ice and filled it up full of water and poured water into the truck, and just kept doing that until he filled the whole system up full of water. But when they got back to their place up here, they found out they couldn't drive all the way into their little cabin over here because the snow had gotten so deep, and this is only a two-wheel drive pickup truck. So they had to park it about a mile away up on the county road. Well, I'm sad to say that that night it got down to around 15 degrees. You guys that know anything about auto mechanics know what happens when you have just water in your motor without any antifreeze and it gets that cold. Sure enough, it cracked the block on his truck. So here all of a sudden they were in this desperate situation, living in this little cabin with winter setting in, hardly any firewood. Now they didn't even have a truck to drive, no job, and the only money that they had coming in was this little insurance check that Mary was getting from an industrial accident claim that she had made hurting herself when she was working at a restaurant. And they had hardly any food, so it was really a desperate situation. You see, Mary told Jim she would walk up to the mailbox, and here's what happened. You see, Mary was kind of looking over the situation about what happened with Jim's truck, and she walked up to the mailbox, which was about a 2-mile walk, and she was going to try to find her little check there so she could go to town and get some groceries, you see. And she told Jim, well, if my check's up there, I'll get some groceries and I'll be right back. So she was going to hitchhike into town. Well, when she got up to the mailbox, guess what? Her check was there. And she was standing beside the highway, it was snowing, it was cold out, and she was looking at her check, and she was thinking about this whole situation living with Jim and the little shack that they were in, and she just decided, I'm not going to go back there. And she stuck out her thumb, and she caught a ride, and she disappeared someplace in western Washington, and she never came back. And you know, here was Jim now. Just kind of consider this a little bit. Here was Jim. He was living in this little shack in the woods. He was... His truck was broken, the motor was cracked on it, winter was setting in, he hardly had any firewood, he had hardly any food. Now his girlfriend left him, and now there was no money coming in. He was in a desperate situation, but you know, there was one thing that Jim had, and they're fairly common staples here in North Idaho. He had 3 bottles of whiskey and a .45 caliber pistol. You're kind of wondering, I think, what's this got to do with the story about the pastor and what happened at the church? Well, it's got a lot to do with it. You see, Jim started drinking whiskey. In fact, that first day, he drank a whole 5th of whiskey. He didn't eat anything, he just drank. Passed out that night. Next morning, he woke up. So he started in on the 2nd bottle of whiskey, and that day he drank the whole next 5th of whiskey. The 3rd day he woke up, his face was getting all puffy, his fingers were all swollen up, alcohol toxemia was setting in, and he was becoming really desperate, looking at his situation, feeling really discouraged. He took the .45 caliber handgun, pulled the hammer back, stuck it to his head, and was going to commit suicide. And as he had the gun to his head, he started thinking about those strange religious people that lived over the mountain, on the other side of the mountain, that had talked to them about Jesus. And he thought to himself, you know, maybe I need to go talk to them. And so he carefully took the gun, and he set the gun down and set the hammer down very carefully and put it on the table. He staggered up over through the woods to our place and came in and started talking with my wife. I wasn't home at the time. And he was telling my wife about what was going on in his life and everything. And about that time I came in. And I started asking Jim, I said, what's going on? And he looked bad, looked really, really bad. And I said, what's happening? And he said, well, you know, and he told me the whole story about how he was going to commit suicide. He'd been drinking pretty heavy. His girlfriend left him. He's in a desperate situation. And I said to him, I said, well, you know what we need to do. And he said, well, I think so. And I said, well, I tell you what, let's go. And so Jim and I, we walked back over to his cabin over the mountain. We got that half of bottle of whiskey that he had, and we staggered back over to the woods, over to my house. And Jim and I went out into the woods together, and we went and we knelt down in the snow, and we said a prayer together. And Jim took that bottle of whiskey and he dumped it out on the ground, and Jim gave his life to Christ. At that point, we started working with Jim. We started doing, and remember, we didn't have electricity, we didn't have running water. We had to heat water up on a wood cook stove at that time to make hot water. And we were hauling water to just bring it into our place. And we started doing steam baths with him. We got him on a really good diet. He quit smoking cigarettes. And it was amazing to start seeing the changes that took place in Jim. And then, as he started changing, he was studying the Word of God with us, and I said to him one day, I said, Jim, I want to ask you a question. Do you think that the Lord could help you to get a motor for your truck? And he said, well, I don't know. And I said, well, let's just challenge God and see what happens. And he said, okay. So we knelt down together in the living room of my house, and we started praying. And I said, Lord, you know, if it's possible, please help us to find a motor for Jim's truck. And Jim went back over to his little cabin that night. Now, the next morning, something amazing happened. A man called me on the phone that lived in a town about 14 miles from here, and he said, hey, Jeff, he said, I'm cleaning out my garage. You know, winter's kind of setting in here, and I need to get rid of a old 352 big block Ford engine that's sitting in there. I'm not going to use it. You know anybody that needs one? And I said, it's funny you should happen to call. Yeah. How much do you want for it? And he said, $45. Can you imagine? The next day, the Lord provided a motor for $45. And I said, we'll be over to get it this afternoon. And about this time, Jim came over to my place. And I said, Jim, guess what? He goes, what? I said, the Lord provided a motor for your truck. And he goes, oh, you're kidding me. And I said, no, I'm serious. The Lord provided a motor for your truck. And he goes, really? And I said, yeah. And you know how much it's going to be? And he said, how much? I said, $45. And he said, that's incredible. And so he went and got a motor for his truck and brought it back. Well, about this time, a Chinook came in. Some of you that might be watching, especially if you're watching down in New Zealand or Australia or some other place in the world, you probably don't have a clue what a Chinook is. But here in the Pacific Northwest part of the United States, when you have winter conditions and there's snow on the ground and you get a really warm southwesterly wind and it starts raining, it starts melting all the snow, we call that a Chinook. Well, during this time of the Chinook, we built a tripod for replacing the motor on Jim's truck, took the hood off, and I was in there working on Jim's truck, you know, and I'd crawl underneath and mud was dripping in my face while I was tightening the bolts and pulling the motor out and fixing everything, you know, to put this new motor in. And I'll never forget what happened. Friday, we had gotten the motor in and actually got it running. And I was putting the hood on the truck, and the motor wasn't running very good, but I was putting the hood on the truck. And it was Friday late afternoon, and the sun was just over the mountain, and Sabbath was just about ready to start. And I said to him, I said, well, let's finish this up on Sunday. And Jim started walking around the truck really nervously. And he said, I need to take it for a test drive. And I said, nah, Jim, come on, Sabbath is just about ready to start. You don't need to take it for a test drive right now. And he said, no, seriously. He said, I'd like to take it for a test drive. I said, no, well, let's worry about it Sunday. And you know, I could tell what was happening because I've been there, I've done that. Friday night fever was setting in. This guy had gone straight for almost a month now. He hadn't touched a drop of alcohol. He hadn't been smoking cigarettes for at least 2.5 weeks. He was on a pretty strict vegetarian diet, been doing steam baths and exercise programs, and he got in the truck and started it up, and he started going down the driveway from our house, and I noticed his taillights weren't working, and the sun was setting, and I was yelling at him, Jim, your taillights! And you know, the registration was even expired on his truck, and he disappeared. And he never came back Friday night. In fact, he never came back Friday night. He never came back Saturday. All day Sabbath, he never showed up for church. Saturday night, he never came back. And then Sunday, he never came back. And then Sunday night, I was sitting in my chair, my favorite chair, with my kerosene lamp sitting next to me, reading one of my favorite books, and I was thinking. And I'll tell you what I was thinking about. I was thinking about that pastor, how that pastor booted me out of all my positions in the church. And I was thinking about some of the pastor's friends and how they were siding with him in this whole thing, and I was having a lot of resentment, and I was just kind of not. You know, one thing that made me feel good was the fact that I knew that I had my theology right, and that at least I ate right, and I walked right, and my wife and I dressed right, and we talked right, and you know, we were pretty holy people. And that made me feel pretty good, especially in light of having a pastor who was causing so many problems in our church. And then I started thinking about Jim. You know, here we had been almost a month helping Jim out. We'd been hauling water, doing steam baths with him. We'd been feeding him from the meager amount of food that we had because we hardly had any money coming in back in those days. And we prayed, and the Lord gave a motor to Jim. I put that motor into the truck and had mud and rain and slushy snow dripping in my face, and I got to thinking about him, you know, and I started thinking, well, fine, you know, I don't care if he even comes back either. We've invested enough time with him. And I was sitting there, and I was rocking in my chair by my kerosene lamp, reading my favorite book, Individuality and Religion, you know, the right to stand up for right principles, feeling pretty self-righteous. And as I was sitting there, it was like I heard a voice over my shoulder talking into my ear. And that voice said something like, Jeff, what would you have done if I would have wrote you off the first time that you made a mistake when you first tried to be a Christian? I didn't want to hear that, you know, that's the last thing I needed to hear right then. I was feeling pretty good about myself, you know, after all, I had my theology right, and I was doing everything right. And I started reading the book, and I just kind of ignored that still small voice speaking to my heart. And the voice came a little bit louder, and it said, Jeff, remember the time you did this? Remember the time you did that? Hey, Jeff, do you remember this? When you first tried to become a Christian? What would you have done if I would have cast you aside the first time that you tried to become a Christian? And I started sinking in my chair because the Holy Spirit was speaking to my heart, and I was just kind of feeling so bad, and I was thinking, oh my. And then I remember the story in Luke chapter 15, I think it's like verses 1 through 20, where it talks about the lost sheep. Remember, there was the 99 in the fold, and there was the one lost sheep, and that the master went out to try to find that one lost sheep. And I started to realize, you know, there'd been a problem. And that problem wasn't with the pastor so much as I thought. The problem wasn't so much with some of the pastor's friends in the church, but there was a problem with me in the way that I was interacting with people, and the way that I looked at people, and the way that I judged people by my own standards of what I thought was right and wrong, especially with those who I thought knew better. And you know, here I was talking about, you know, being like Jesus and reflecting His character and preparing to be one of the 144,000, and yet at the same time, I was conducting myself in such a way that was totally unreflective of Christ's character. I started thinking about that parable of the one lost sheep, and I started thinking about it real hard. And I started to realize, you know, I had an intellectual understanding of the truth, but I was lacking in a practical experience with Christ and putting that truth into my heart. And as I started thinking about that story of the one lost sheep, I started realizing that I needed to do something. I thought to myself, if Jim was that lost sheep, should I sit there and think to myself, I'm just going to write Jim off? Or should I go look for that one lost sheep? Well, God has given us wives, and wives are pretty wise. I started to explained to my wife some of the feelings I was having. And as I was explaining to my wife about my feelings, I said to her, you know what I think I need to do? I think what I need to do is get in my truck and drive to town and go to every single bar in the little town of St. Mary's, Idaho. Now at that time there was 6 bars in this town. There was just about as many bars as there were churches. That's something to think about. But anyhow, I decided, you know, I'm going to go to all these different bars and I'm going to try to find my friend Jim. And my wife said, you're going to go to the bar and you're going to try to find Jim, and what are you going to do when you find him? And she reminded me that this fellow, when he drinks, he likes to fight. And I said, well, yeah, but I'm impressed I should do this. And she said, and when you find your friend Jim, what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to let him know I love him. And she said, can I understand this properly? What you're going to do is you're going to go to the bar, you're going to try to find Jim, and you're going to walk up to him in the bar and you're going to say, I love you. She said, you're crazy. And I said, I know it sounds crazy, but that's what I want to do. And she said, well, I think we better pray. And so her and I knelt down together and we prayed together. And I got in my truck and I started driving to town. And as I was driving to town, I started thinking about those words of my wife. You're crazy. You're going to go to the bar and tell this guy you love him? And so I started praying pretty hard. I said, Lord, you know, if you can make this happen, just please, can I find my friend Jim without having to go to all the different bars? Now, this is the kind of thing that defies the theory of evolution, because these kind of things just can't happen. Think of the mathematical possibilities of this just coincidentally happening. I was driving the 9 miles in the town. It turns out that Jim was in another part of town, and he was at some people's house that he had met at a bar, and they were at a party. And he was driving his truck because the taillights didn't work and it was nighttime on the back roads, and he didn't have registration on his license plates. He was driving the back roads towards a bar. I was coming in the town. He parked in an alley behind a bar, was walking down around the street corner. I came around a corner. He was walking to the front door of the bar. I drove by. I turned like this and looked at the front door of this first bar I went by just to see the silhouette of his face as the door went shut. Think about that. First bar, you know, split-second timing. If I would have came just about a minute later, he would have been in the bar. I wouldn't even know where he was at. So I still had the keys to the church. They hadn't been taken away from me. So I went over to the local Adventist church and went down in the basement and got in the phone book and I looked up the bar. And I called that bar up on the telephone. The bartender answered the phone and he said, hello? And I said, hi, I'm looking for a guy named Jim. I don't know any Jims here. And I said, well, he's kind of new in the area. He's kind of a short, stocky guy. He just moved here, you know, about a month and a half ago or so, 2 months ago. He goes, oh, I think I know who you're talking about. He said, just a second. And then he kind of pulled the phone away from his mouth and he yelled, hey, Jim, telephone. And then he put the phone down on the bar counter. Now, when you put a phone down on a bar counter, do you know what happens? It creates the perfect audio amplification device. I could hear boom, 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 boom. And then I could hear people laughing. I could hear glasses clinking. I could smell cigarette smoke coming out of the telephone, actually, almost. And I could hear this voice kind of mumbling, and it was coming closer and closer to the phone. And all of a sudden, I heard the phone get picked up, and I heard this voice saying, who would be calling me? Nobody knows me. Hello? And I said, hi, Jim. This is Jeff. And he went, and I said, hey, Jim, there's no reason to make any excuses or to try to think of what to say. You know, it's obvious. You've went out and you've kind of like blown it. You know, you made a mistake here. You're out drinking. He goes, well, yeah. And I said, well, you know, Jim, I just wanted to call and let you know that I love you. And he goes, huh? I said, Jim, I just want to let you know that I love you and that tomorrow you're welcome to come back to my house. I said, you know, you've been drinking for quite a number of years. You might not get over this right away. I said, I struggled with some things when I first became a Christian too. I know what it's like, but I want to let you know that I love you and I stand behind you and I'm there to try to help you. And you can come to my house and look me square in the eye and you can tell that I'm not going to condemn you for what's happened, okay? There's always the chance to come back and try over again and get the victory over this. And he said, let me understand you right, Jeff. You've called me up just to let me know that you love me and you care this much about me that you want to help me? And I said, yeah. And this full-grown man burst into tears standing there beside this bar with a telephone in his hand. And he started crying. And to tell you the truth, I started crying because of him crying. And then as I talked to him, he cried more. And the more he cried, the more it moved me. And then it moved him. And it was actually quite a moving moment, you might say. And afterwards, he asked me this question, and I don't know how you would answer this, but he asked me this question. He said, Jeff, how did you find out where I was at? What was I supposed to say to something like that? You know, like, how did I find out where he was at? And I said, Jim, I said, you might have a hard time believing this, but I believe the angels of God led me to where you were at. Well, when I got in my truck and I headed home, I started doing some pretty serious thinking. And that serious thinking wasn't so much about Jim as it was about the pastor and some of the people in my local church. And as I was driving home, I started thinking about that Bible verse in 2 Corinthians 5:20. It says, we are ambassadors for Christ. You know, what is an ambassador? An ambassador is somebody that moves from one nation. He's a citizen of one nation, and he moves to another nation. He lives there to represent that nation, you know, to represent the nation that he came from. And I thought, you know, as Christians, that's what we are. That's what Paul is saying in Corinthians. You know, you're an ambassador for Christ. You are representing his heavenly kingdom. What kind of ambassador are you? And I was thinking to myself, boy, what kind of ambassador have I been? You know, how am I treating people? What kind of representation am I giving for the kingdom that I stand for and for the master of the kingdom that I stand for? And then in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 2 and 3, those thoughts came to my mind where Paul says, ye are an epistle, or in other words, ye are a letter. Ye are a letter written in our hearts, known and read of all men. For as much as ye are manifestly declared to be an epistle of Christ, or a letter of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God. Not in the tables of stone, but in the fleshly tables of the heart. You see, our lives are a letter. Our lives are a letter that are read and known by all men. What kind of letter are we? When people look at us and we're this letter of love, that's a letter of recommendation for Jesus Christ, what kind of letter of recommendation are we? Are we really recommending people to Christ? Or are we taking and looking at people and judging them by how we eat or how we dress or the things that we believe and judge them, and then if they don't match up with the way that we believe, we criticize them and we actually make enemies out of them, and we start getting into this we and them mentality? And we're supposed to be ambassadors for Christ. We're supposed to be letters of recommendation. You know, sometimes we can get so busy defending truth with a small t that we miss the truth with a capital T. Did you catch what I just said? Sometimes we get so wrapped up in defending the truth, quote unquote, with a small t, that we miss the truth with a capital T. The way, the truth, and the life. You know, and I thought to myself, that's exactly what I've been doing in my life. I'm so involved with trying to defend the truth that I've missed Him. I've lost sight of Him, who is the way, the truth, and the life. In Isaiah 56, verse 10, it says, his watchmen are blind, they are ignorant, they are all dumb dogs that cannot bark, sleeping, lying down, loving to slumber. I used to look at that and I thought, yeah, you know, a lot of the watchmen in the church are like a bunch of dumb dogs. They won't bark, you know, they don't give the word of warning. They're not like the men of Zion that should give the trumpet a certain sound and call sin by its right name. And you know, there's a time to call sin by its right name. But when I thought about this Bible verse, I started to realize there's different kinds of dogs. And not just dumb dogs and dogs that bark. You know, there's, for instance, Pomeranians, there's Mexican Chihuahuas. Have you ever seen a Pomeranian or Mexican Chihuahua? I call them little yappy dogs. You know, you see them and they're like yap, 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 yap. And I've asked quite a number of people about yappy dogs, and I said, what do you feel like doing when you're around a yappy dog? And almost everybody smiles and they say, give them a boot. And you know, I thought to myself, yeah, you know, I was being a dog that was willing to bark, but maybe I was being like a Mexican Chihuahua. Hey, I'm not picking on any of you folks that have Mexican Chihuahuas, by the way. But, you know, I was being a Mexican Chihuahua. I was in the church and I was looking at everybody and everything that was happening, and I was barking about this and barking about that, and it gets to a point that people would just like boot you out of the church. I've had people come to me and say, you know, I've been kicked out of the church, you know, for standing up for the truth. And the truth is that many times people get in trouble in their local church, not so much for standing up for the truth as for the way they stand up for the truth. and the way that they end up treating people in an unkind way. You know, there's another kind of dog, by the way. There's the Great Dane, or the Malamute, or the big husky dog. You know, they're the kind of dog that's tied up in the backyard, or they are on the porch if you live out in the country on your property, and they just lay there and they just are quiet. And you don't hardly even know they're around except for petting them or feeding them from time to time. But then one evening comes and you hear woof. You know what you do? You go to the window and you check out what's happening. Well, you see, I decided that I needed to quit being a little yappy dog, and I needed to start being a Great Dane, a Malamute, a big husky. I decided to change the way that I looked at things and how I treated people that I dealt with. In fact, I really decided that I wanted to be a letter of recommendation for Christ. And so I started changing my tactics. I started going to church week after week, and I never said anything. I was quiet. I was thankful for the fact that people were happy to have me be there. And I started to look at the pastor and realize, you know something? Even though he and I disagree about a lot of things theologically, and this is an important point, even though we disagreed about some things theologically, he was still somebody for whom Christ died. And I needed to treat him with the same respect that I would treat anybody else, even though we disagreed. Now that's a hard thing for some people to really swallow or to even get their arms around, but yet, you know, we quote Bible verses about that we should love our enemies, we should do good to those that persecute us, but sometimes I wonder why we make those kind of Bible verses exempt when it comes to situations that come close to home with those that we disagree with. And so I decided that I was going to start doing things a little differently. You know, there was a person in our church that was that I didn't really get along with very well. And he didn't like me, and it was pretty evident that I didn't like him. And here we were in a church. We were supposed to be all ye are brethren, you know, and we're members of the church, and we're supposed to love each other. And here's this polarization going on, and two church members not liking each other. It's like, if you can't like each other here, how would you ever like each other in heaven? And I started thinking about this fellow, and I was thinking, what could I do to try to mend a friendship with him out of all the mean things that I had said to him and comments that I had made in Sabbath school class. And I had heard he was out of firewood. I realized what I needed to do. I cut all this really, really good, what they call buckskin tamarack. It's a kind of wood here that grows in the Pacific Northwest. When it's dead, it's the hardest of the softwoods. And so I found out when he wasn't home and when his wife wasn't home and when his kids weren't home. And I went over to his house and opened his garage door where he had stacked all his firewood. There was one lone piece of wood left there. And I split this whole cord, this whole truckload of firewood, and I stacked it piece by piece in his garage. And let me tell you, every single piece that I put in that garage was like a healing balm to my soul and my attitude towards this brother. And when I finally got done, there was this big pile of tamarack buckskin firewood in his garage, and I shut the garage door and I didn't say anything to anybody. When he came home that night, he went out to his garage to get what he thought was his last stick of firewood. And as he went into his garage, he looked and he saw this big pile of firewood. Of course, he started calling all his different friends in the community, and nobody knew where it came from. Well, as the saying says, a little bird finally told him. Turned out that I had given some firewood to some other church members at that same time. And one of the church members said, well, you know what? I think Jeff gave that firewood to you. Next Sabbath at church, this is after a couple of weeks, that Sabbath at church, he came up to me and said, Jeff, I would like to ask you a question. I said, what's that? He said, did you put that firewood in my garage? And I hesitated and I said, well, yeah. And he just looked there with this blank look on his face, and he said, thanks. And he walked away. And you know, the next church elections nominating committee, he tried to get me put back into some of my positions in the church. You know, doing kindness to people that we disagree with and reflecting Christ not by word but by action. You know, I've heard people say we should preach the gospel all the time and when necessary use words. Well, there was the pastor. What to do with the pastor? Well, you see, I needed to realize I needed to treat our pastor differently. Yeah, we disagreed on some things, but like I said, I had to recognize this pastor was a soul for whom Christ had died. And so I wanted to treat him in a way that Jesus would treat him, not the way that in my Pharisaical, self-righteous self would judge him and treat him in an unkind way, but to treat him like Christ would treat him. You know, if we would only treat all people that way, just think of the difference that would happen in the church. And so I started befriending the pastor, and you know what happened? This little newsletter that we had called Laymen Ministry News, I was doing them, I started doing them on a bi-weekly basis and then finally a monthly basis because the mailing list kept growing, and I was doing them on the Smith Corona typewriter. And he told me, he said, "Jeff, have you ever seen a Macintosh computer?" Now, no offense to PC users, but I'm a Mac guy, okay? And turned out that he had a Mac computer. It was one of those first ones, the 512K machine or something. It was an old one. He showed me on his computer about how you could cut and paste things, and I was going, wow, this is a whole lot better than using a typewriter. Showed me how to use the operating system, and he started helping to get our mailing list on a database so that we could actually print the people's names out instead of having to write them out by hand or have these typewritten little labels that we would photocopy with a label in a photocopy machine. And we started using a dot matrix printer for printing out the labels, and the mailing list kept growing and growing. In fact, it started growing to be 250 people, then 500 people, and 600 people, and he was working with us, and then he showed me how to use the word processor for writing, and then I got a program that was a layout and design program so I could design the newsletters, and then finally got a laser printer, and this was all happening over a period of about 4 years. The pastor was coming to my house, and we were working on computers together, and I was the most visited church member in the district because I think we were the only two people in this whole area around North Idaho here that had a Mac computer back in those days. And 4 years went by. He had been in the district now for almost 6 years, but 4 years had gone by since we had our major blowout at our church. And one night, he was at our place. And I'll never forget this. He lived about an hour and 20 minutes from our house, so when he got done helping me on the computers and such, he had to drive a long ways, but it was about 11 o'clock at night. And he was working at the computer, his eyes were kind of glossed over, and I walked up to him, and I said to him, I said, "Pastor, what do you believe about such and such?" And this was a pretty heavy-duty theological question. And he stopped, and he turned and he looked at me, and he had this look in his face like, "Do we dare talk about this?" And I said, "No, serious, Pastor, what do you think about that?" And he said, "Well, Jeff, this is what I believe." And he started explaining his views to me. And I went, "Well, that's incredible." You know, I said, you know, that's really close to what was taught at one of the General Conference sessions back in 1895. And I went and grabbed an old General Conference bulletin, and I brought it out, and I started reading to him by this particular author. And he goes, "Wow, that guy back then taught this same idea?" And I said, "Yeah." And he was like, "Well, I'd like to read that." And we were sharing things back and forth. We didn't agree on everything. There was a lot of things that we still disagreed on. But you know what had changed? We became friends. You know, it's a lot easier and even more effective to communicate with somebody who is your friend than with somebody who's your enemy. Satan is the master at polarizing people, you know, the we and them syndrome. You know, like someone says something like, "We know where they're coming from." And then that person says, "Well, yeah, I know where you're coming from." And, you know, we might not be saying that, but subconsciously that's the way that we interact. And the truth is we are not listening. We're reading into the motives, we're reading into the words, and we oftentimes react by them saying something. We go farther this extreme and they go farther that extreme, and Satan polarizes people in the church and even the community or even in a family by people going to farthest extremes because he knows the most effective way to be able to fragment the church or a family is by the process of divide and conquer. But you know, when you are communicating with someone who's a friend, they're willing to listen. They're willing to take the time to hear you out, oftentimes. And so when we make friends with people, we accept people for a person whom Christ has died, and we start sharing with them as a friend, we'll find out that we'll be able to communicate a lot better. You know, many trials in the church that come to us in a church are there for the purpose of helping us to develop character. We might not always agree with other people, but we don't need to make people our enemy. Now, I know there's some situations where there's personalities that clash and people just sometimes have to avoid each other because there's major personality conflicts and such. But if we're really doing everything on our part to reflect Christ, allow the Holy Spirit to work through our lives to try to really truly be a Christian to someone, and they still are mean to us and such, we don't have to retaliate to them. We might have to withdraw, and we might have to keep our distance, but oftentimes love begats love, trust begats trust, friendship begats friendship. And if we really truly reflect Christ, Christ can use us to mend broken relationships and to be able to get to the point where we can influence each other. And sometimes it's these problems that we have in our families or in a church that are these problems of tension that oftentimes help us to develop the aspects of character that we so much need to have developed in our own lives. I had a friend once who was a concert violinist, and he said, Jeff, I want to demonstrate something to you. And he took out his violin, and he played 2 notes. I'd love to hear Jamie George do this. He played 2 notes, and he made the notes just be like a little bit out of tune with each other. And if you ever heard somebody trying to learn to play the violin, you know how it can just kind of grate on your nerves. I mean, it's like the sounds that they make just, ooh. And he took these 2 notes, and he spread them apart, and they weren't so bad, but the closer and closer that they came together, the more and more they were irritating and kind of hurt your ears, and just kind of like a fingernail on a chalkboard type sound. And then all of a sudden the 2 notes came into harmony, and they made beautiful music. And he put his violin down. He said, Jeff, you know, that's just the same way it is in relationships. Oftentimes when we get the closest to breaking through and really making a friendship with someone where there's been a lot of tension and misunderstandings, it's the most painful part of our experience right before we break into harmony with each other. You know, in Luke 6:27 and 28, it does say, love your enemies, do good to them that hate you. We read this intellectually, but yet for some reason we don't have it come home to our hearts, and we don't apply it in our relationships with other people. It says, love your enemies, do good to them that hate you, bless them that curse you, and pray for them that do what? Which despitefully use you. That's Luke chapter 6, verses 27 and 28. The pastor's term here came to its end, and he was called to go to a new district. In fact, the moving truck had loaded up all their stuff and had moved out of town, and he drove up to our place, and he wanted to say goodbye to my wife and I. Now this was the pastor, quote unquote, that we had all the problems with 6 years before. And I wasn't home, so he said goodbye to my wife when he was driving out of the dirt road coming up to the ministry here, and I was driving in, and we met on kind of a corner. And I opened the door, and he got out of his car, and he walked around, and he came over to the door of my truck, and I had my door open, and I was just kind of turned around sideways like I'm sitting here in the desk, you know, sitting in my truck seat. And he looked at me, and he said, hey, Jeff, you know, the moving truck has just left, and I'm on my way out and heading off to my new district. And I said, yeah. I said, I'm going to really miss you, you know. And he said to me, he said, Jeff, you know something? You're my best friend in these 2 churches. And I was thinking to myself, what? This pastor is my best friend? I about fell over backwards in the truck seat. And I said, well, you know, I've really grown to appreciate you a lot too. And then he shuffled his feet around on the ground, and he said, you know, Jeff, when I first came here to this church, I had this idea that justification alone or forgiveness alone was the gospel. But he said, now my relationship with you and all the talks that we have, all the talks that we've had, I realize now that sanctification or spiritual growth is just as important a part of the gospel as forgiveness. And I sat there and looked at him, and I said, well, Pastor, you know, when you first came here, I had this idea that spiritual growth or sanctification alone was the gospel. And now with my relationship with you over the years, I've come to appreciate and understand that forgiveness is a big part of the gospel, and that they're a package deal that comes together. And he said, yeah, he said, I'm going to really miss you. And then I looked at the pastor, and I asked him this question, and he had completely forgotten that this was the question I asked him 6 years before in the church, the very first time I met him. I said, Pastor, can I ask you a question? He said, sure. I said, are you nervous about moving to the new district and pastoring a 2-church district where you're going to be going? And he shuffled his feet around on the ground and said, yeah, I'm nervous, but I know that the Lord will give me the grace to be able to try to be a good pastor. And I was in my heart kind of like, yes! You see, the Lord had allowed him to grow, and the Lord had allowed me to grow. And that's such an important thing to remember, that in relationships, that oftentimes those that we disagree with are the ones that we need the most to help us to come to a better revelation of Christ in our own personal life. In closing, I'd just like to say that may each one of us be the ambassador that He, Christ, would have us to be. May each one of us be that letter of recommendation to Jesus Christ, because you know, that's what He's calling us to do. He's calling us to be an ambassador. He's calling us to be a letter of recommendation.